The thing is, performance is an open category. It's not just one thing. It's like, it's this broad set of questions. Two-dimensional art creates a world, right? If I was to draw a stick figure on this whiteboard, we would already have a sense of space around the stick figure. It would already be in a world, right? When you make a sculpture, it's in our space. And so the questions of the action and reaction seem a little bit different. Whenever you're looking at a sculpture, you're also looking at the space you're in. And with a painting or a photograph, you're looking into a space that is not present.
It's important to know the author, so putting a face and a voice behind the words that he wrote really lets us know where he was coming from with the article.
With this piece, I really became interested in how much people took liberties with statues. And people like to touch paintings, but not much, right? But listen, hang out, next time you go to a museum or a gallery, hang out near the sculpture, right? And just watch what people do to it. The first thing they do is touch it, right? As soon as the guard's not looking, you're like, And we know it's going to be marble or bronze. We know it's going to be cold. We know there's not going to, but people love to just get right up in it. That was what was interesting for me, is what is it about a three-dimensional image as this physical object that people were so, it was like they were drawn to this physical contact. And so I wanted to think okay, if we're thinking about the viewer and the object, both as performing, both as acting, what's the two-directional ways that we can think about that? So for me, that's where this article came out of, is to just be kind of amazed at how much people, wanted to physically interact with a sculpture. I used to teach at a college that the auditorium had this long hallway along the side, and there was a bronze bust of somebody who nobody even remembered who he was, right? There was a plaque on it, no one cared. Everybody loved this bust because they all touched the nose for good luck when they were going into their exams. So imagine this bronze bust with this shiny nose that's happening. That's a history of this bust interacting with people. And I was thinking about that and other things, like how much, most of the students didn't know, care, or remember who was represented. They just knew it was a person, and they wanted to do this thing to this image of this other person, which is to touch the nose. That is interesting because it's not about the content. It's not about the famous person who's the subject of the bust. It's about something else. So that's what I was interested in. Where does that desire that we have for this kind of activity come from?
The touching of a statue or a bust or something like that, I never thought of it that way, because when I was younger, when I was going to museums or whatever, my dad and my parents were always like, don't touch it, don't touch it, don't touch it.
Do you think of yourself as a three-dimensional sculpture when you're looking at these things, or do you think of the artwork differently than yourself?
There are artists who do play with that and sometimes create performance art where they are adopting the look of the statue or sculptural objects. But for me, what's most interesting is that we are me in the sculpture, and me and you in the room, and me in the chair. We are all different bodies in space that are relating. And so, and the difference between those bodies is important, because as the viewer of a sculpture, I can move around it, as the sculpture cannot move around it. But how do we understand those power dynamics? What happens if we just see, well, what is the sculpture doing to produce a set of reactions in me, rather than just see me, the viewer, as being the one who has all the power?
It broadens my view of art and sort of what can be considered art in different mediums, such as performance, as well as inspiring me to be more creative and, I guess, taking more risks with my art and not being so safe with what I make.
So it's not just that it's hopelessly subjective and different, and everybody's different. Therefore, we can say nothing, right? That's not what I'm. That's it. But what happens is that each person is particular. The moment of that encounter is particular. The relationship of you to that bronze bust will be determined by, your height, the time of day of the light, the ways in which you think about and relate to the features of the person who's represented in the bust and how they relate to your own history. So there's all of these different avenues that are going to make each of us very different in the interaction. But at the same time, the sculpture has a set of physical and describable traits. It's got a certain height, it depicts a certain thing, it's a certain color, it's, and so on. So it's not, so there's a kind of range of possibilities that's offered by any object and a range of possibilities that's offered by any viewing subject. And they come together to create a unique mixture, but it's not just that everybody's going to do their own thing. Because otherwise we would have no way to analyze anything. But when we start to think about I don't really do this in the article, but another way of doing this is to think about what are the long-term wide patterns? Like, why is it that one of the first things in a regime change in a country that happens is that you tear down the statues, right? Like, this is a significant symbolic act. So those statues have meanings that are not just particular to the viewers, because we can see that same thing's happening in this part of the world and that part of the world. And it's the same impulse. But that's what's interesting, is to keep in mind all of, when you're looking at an artwork, a piece of advertising, a piece of political speech, whatever is the thing that you're studying, there's the intentions of the people who arrange ideas and materials and images and words into that thing. And then that thing does stuff in the world that is about those intentions, but sometimes gets away with you, or gets away with from those ideas. So you can think about all the advertisements you've ever seen that kind of suddenly become a bad meme. Like the product is like someone's trying to earnestly sell you toothpaste or something, but it just goes wrong and it looks like something else, and suddenly it becomes a meme that's circulating that no one's thinking about toothpaste, they're laughing at this. That's a kind of fun example of remembering of this trajectory that that cultural production, which is not just art but advertising, political speech, texts, objects, internet memes, all of this has an intentional creator that is based on a particular position of that creator, who they are, where they came from, what their beliefs are, what resources they have access to. All of that goes into the creation of a piece of cultural production. And we have to understand that movement, and then we have to think about that piece of cultural production as also having its own life in the world and creating effects. And then there's all of us who are at our computer screens looking at the meme, or seeing the advertisement on television, or walking up to the sculpture in the public square. We are also producing a next layer of engagement that also needs to be analyzed and understood, because all of us have positions too. We all come from specific places with specific histories, and so all of that feeds in. This is what's, any kind of cultural analysis, or just being a kind of smart and savvy citizen of this media-soaked age, right, is about thinking about that leap from intention to realization to reception of any cultural object.
There is definitely a connection, because the lecture was on performance art, and we were talking about statues, and in a way, Stephen Warble did somewhat present himself as a statue, I feel like, especially when he was doing his silent pantomiming. He was effectively silent and visible, but not interactable with. So I think, that could be applied. Dial
back for a second. The terms subject and object are used in the humanities and philosophy to refer to the dynamic between the one who's thinking and acting and what you're thinking and acting looking like. So or looking at. So the most simplest thing is that I am a subject, and I am looking at an object. This is the simplest way of thinking about that. When two subjects interact with each other, they both mutually try to recognize each other as, as another subject. And this is a difficult thing. I mean, so imagine yourself walking down the street, right? You're in your head, it's a crowded sidewalk, you've got a lot to do today, you're thinking about your assignments, you're thinking about what you're gonna have for lunch. You're walking down the street, you've got places to go. There's somebody else who's also in their head thinking about their lunch, and you run into each other. This is a moment when the object nature of another subject confronts you very physically, right? Because you're both in your own perspectives. Think about another moment when, on the far end of the spectrum, when two subjects are seeing each other as being, for that moment of mutual recognition, when someone's understanding that, that you are looking at them, they are looking at you in a way that sees it as a dynamic. This is one way that psychoanalysts talk about love. So, which is that moment of deep, invested, mutual recognition and embeddedness. Now, this spectrum, running into somebody at the street, and the sort of intersubjective act of love, neither of them are 100%. They both involve some of this dynamic between subject and object, right? And most of our interactions on a day-to-day basis are in between these two things, right, obviously. And so we're always engaging with other people as if they are objects and subjects. And the real question for us is an ethical question, is how do we treat objects? And that's what I think one of the things I'm interested in the article is to treat, do we treat objects well or not? And the reason this is important is because there's always a degree of objectification in any interaction with another person. And so when, for instance, again, to think about popular culture and the media, when we are critiquing the ways in which people are being objectified, for instance, by a television show, that's because the complex, particular personhood of the model on the beach in the swimsuit that's on the television screen is not being respected at that moment, right? They're being turned into a physical object. So this is part of the dynamic that we need to pull back from and be thinking about how the relationship to others' objecthood can be thought of equitably rather than exploitively. So I'm sorry, there's a whole departure from this, but the important thing is to, when Whitney Davis says that objects can never be subjects, he means that they can't really recognize you in that kind of full, psychological way because it's a thing, right? And so there's never going to be the same kind of agency around this pen or this notebook. Even though sometimes, objects have a lot of agency, it's never going to fully be that moment of mutual recognition and that we reserve for other human beings and sentient beings. So that's that kind of dynamic. But it's important to show that something in between, and the statue is a really weird thing in between, right? Because it's totally a physical material object, but also it represents, an image is a subject. And so our engagement with the liberties that we're given, because we can move and the statue can't move, is a little theater of ethics that can tell us something. One of the things I tried to do is to show that this is, for centuries, this question of what counts as a subject has been really interesting. And so the oyster in the oyster bed is not a recognizing subject that we can fall in love with, right? Thinking, to use my earlier example. But at the same time, it does have these activities. It is alive. The earlier people who wrote about statues, and I think that's the Clement of Alexandria quote that we're talking about. One of the anxieties historically about statues having power is what's called idolatry, right? And so in the Christian religion, and in many religions, but especially in the Christian religion, it's one of the 10 commandments: "Thou shalt not worship false idols." And if you think of what that, the idea of the idol is that the statue, the representation of the divinity is invested with spiritual power. And so Clement of Alexandria is arguing against statues because he's not talking about the statue of the, like the guy in the hallway next to the auditorium. He's talking about the idol of a false god that's worshipped as if it's the god itself, which is again part of the, it's one of the central components of Christian religion is to deny that that objects should be worshipped as if they were powerful, right? And so the long history of Christianity and its many different versions is a lot about images, right? So Protestantism, Catholicism, are in many ways debating how we should think about how to deal with images and objects and statues, and what kind of spiritual message or spiritual power they have. So that's the backdrop to this. And I use that quote in the article to show that it's been that again, the statue, because of it looks like a human being, right, has always been one of the most complex of objects because it looks like a subject. So it's not just that, like if I have an axe on the table, something that's still an object that has a use in the world and can do things in the world, but a three-dimensional representation of a person looks like a subject, whereas an axe doesn't look like a subject, if that makes sense. Sometimes we get into this kind of like terminology and stuff that starts to be too detached from what we're talking about. So if you feel at any moment that you need just a grounding and just say that again in plainer language, I'm good with that, because in any conversation sometimes we build up a little micro vocabulary for ourselves and we all have to remember what it's really about. So sculptures of corpses are rare, right, in the tradition. Most sculptures are of like living things, and again the whole point of a sculpture is to keep an idea alive. And so the sculpture of the corpse is the limit case, the thing that people are arguing against all the time. Like sculpture's supposed to be alive, like sculpture's supposed to come back to life. The famous story of Pygmalion is, the sculptor who animates the sculpture of a woman because she needs to be alive. And so the counterpoint of that is this role of the corpse in the history of sculpture, which is, again, exceedingly rare because there's too much equivalence between the actual stillness of the depicted body. So I use the example of the poet Percy Shelley, his monument, the actual stillness of the dead body that washed up on the shore, and the stillness of the sculpture itself. And so there's a kind of anxiety around this stillness and death that pervades the way that critics of sculpture have talked about it historically, because they want sculpture to be alive. And so again, I'm always interested in how this desire is working. Like, why is it that we make these marble and bronze and wooden representations of people and want them to be alive, but also are kind of happy they're not? Like movable animatronic sculpture, been around for thousands of years. We could make our sculptures move, 2,000 or more years ago, right? Why don't we have that many moving sculptures in the history of art? Because they're too real. There's too much going on. So we don't want them to be representations of corpses, but we don't want them to be too movable, because it's a satisfying place to be like, the sculpture needs me. Like, the sculpture needs me to be like, to move around it and to give it life and to things like that. And it's, and that's that interaction. So that's kind of what I use the images of corpses precisely as you're saying, because they evoke a very different feeling when the viewer approaches them and looks at them, because the white marble sculpture of Shelley on the shore looks like the pale corpse, and they act exactly the same way, right? They're both just going to lay there. And I mean, however brutal it is to say it like that, that's the thing that most of the history of sculpture and the writing about it wants to deny, wants to say, oh no, but it should be alive. And that's why those couple of sculptures of corpses that I use as these kind of signposts help bring out that the larger movement of the way that sculpture criticism has been working.
How he said he saw statues as, in the article, he said it was cadavers, and like that was really a different way of seeing it. And I'd never seen it before, because when I see a statue, I always saw it as just a still moment in life some time ago. But seeing it as a cadaver, saying like we approach it like it's an actual corpse at a funeral, like we.
Basically, just getting to know the author himself, because sometimes it's so hard when you're reading about something and you can't ask the person himself that wrote it. I think that's incredibly valuable, and you get a ton of insight to the article itself by getting to know his opinion.
More precise, when I talk about our positions, I'm really talking about, the sort of the place that we find ourselves in society. I'm talking about race, gender, class, age, physical ability, and economic standing. Those are all of the big forces that kind of contribute to you being you. And so it's not that we can like start breaking this down and talking about types of people doing this in the same way, but whenever we really are diving into the specific moment of interaction between any viewer and any cultural production. And again, think about it in terms of the meme on the screen, to the advertisement, to the book, to the sculpture, the artwork. That throughout that, the position of the one who's reading, looking, seeing that cultural production is very important to how they will engage with it. And I make this point because I think there's an error in thinking that everybody's always going to see something the same way. That may be a great goal for us, but the world is complex, right? And there's much difference in the world, and one of the things that we can do ethically is to respect those differences and understand how different positions will see the exact same thing with different priorities. And so I want to always keep that in mind and do that. So it's not just like the simple things of like, oh, there's a for that statue in the hallway, there's a whole bunch of people who so the bust had a beard, right? There's a whole bunch of people who like beards and there's people who don't like beards. And this is how we can like divide the world into these two different categories and what they do with this sculpture in the hallway of the person's head. We could, hypothesize about that. But really, what I mean is that like we have differences and that's what makes it interesting to talk and engaging to talk about how a piece of cultural production is a site of us examining and talking about those different ways that we might see the exact same thing. And to think about this as a dynamic that's ethical, right? And that's kind of what I'm arguing in the piece, is that that the viewing encounter, however simple it is an ethics, right? Is that like if you walk up to the nude statue and pat it on the butt, that's an ethical decision to do something with a nude body, whether it's real or not. Like that's ethical. That's this is also about thinking in less vivid encounters, really about why our positions matter, but also how they are able to come together and have dialogue among them. Something looks like it should be familiar, but there's something just off about it. The animatronic, the moving sculpture, the mannequin, all of these things are examples of things that where the object gets too close to looking like and acting like a human being, but ultimately it's not a recognizing subject. And that's where that weirdness comes in, what Freud would call the uncanny. And it's precisely because all of the kind of, like Michael Fried with the steel cube, he's having emotions with it. He's having feelings. This is recalling a certain set of dynamics where he felt endangered. So there's something that's being activated by this physical encounter. Imagine that becomes increasingly amplified the more the sculpture appears to look exactly like a human being, and if it starts acting like a human being. And if you watch things like Westworld, or I'm watching Westworld now, or any of the original movie with Yul Brynner or the current TV show, if you watch any of those, there's this moment when like people are duped into thinking they're alive, and then something happens with the AI or with the cyborg, and that suddenly they're terrified because who they thought was another person is an object. So again, the same dynamic gets played out very much, and that's one of the reasons why a fully realistic, movable sculpture has been always a little, it produces a similar set of anxieties as the sculpture of the corpse does, because it's unsettling the power dynamics between subject and object. This particular piece involved the creation of a real doll, which is a life-size sex doll that was created as a portrait of the artist. She and her body double, which again, she's invested in the doll community. There's a whole group of people who have these lifelike dolls who treat them as if they are domestic partners and are there. And so there's a whole community of this that Amber was doing research in, and so she decided to create one that looked just like her, and then engage in this year-long performance that had many different aspects. It involved these photographs of their domestic life. It involved a series of other performances that were social, but it also involved these abandonment performances, because one of the things that Hawk Swanson's work is very much about is the question of ethics and objectification, and how quickly power dynamics shift between victim and victimizer, and how victims are blamed very quickly, and suddenly turned into the antagonist. So she, instead of saying like a nice distanced way of like, I'm going to resolve these issues for you, her work is really about producing situations that force you to deal with the messy emotions and ethics around this. The abandonment performances, where she would leave the Amber doll in a fold-up chair at a tailgate, at an ice rink, and other things, and then watch how people would interact with her, were very much part of talking, showing this dynamic and showing how quickly chaos would erupt. And one of the things that was really interesting, and this came through interviews with her that I did, is that the abandonment performance at the tailgate involved, again, a bunch of these young men who were taunting Amber Doll, having their pictures with it, and taking liberties with the doll's body and exposing the genitals and the breasts and things like that. I mean, really, challenging things to watch for a very realistic representation of a human being that's sitting there passively in the chair because she cannot move, because she is a statue. Right? One of the interesting things, though, and for Hawk Swanson's work, is that the power dynamics of that are actually echoed in the older men who walk by, who are saying like that's completely inappropriate because they're trying to protect this same immotile, passive body. So in other words, the stillness of Amber Doll, as it sits there in the chair, is being reacted to in two different directions. One by the antagonistic behavior of the young boys, and one by the paternalistic behavior of the men who are trying to stop them. So if the thesis of the argument that I'm making is that the stillness of the statue is an action that incites reactions in the viewer, these are two different reactions to that same moment of stillness that have different ethics, completely different ethics, right? And that's the point, is that the stillness of the statue And what we do with it, what we choose to do with our power to move in front of this representation of a body is, again, a little theater of ethical propositions. And so that Hawk Swanson, by presenting this ethical quandary, shows how those reactions don't always have to be the same and can be different and are, and involve larger ethical choices. I used a really high intensity example like Hawk Swanson's work, in part because it brings home the kind of real meanings of this. Because ultimately this isn't about statues, it's about how we deal with other people. And the question of that engagement with a representation of another person is a way in which these questions can be raised and thought through and analyzed.
I think in terms of making art, it's, interesting how people react to what you have done, let's say a couple of years forward into the future, and how people really take what you do and interpret it in their own ways, especially like you as the person, because earlier on in history you didn't really look at the artist as a personality, whereas now you do. And hearing Dr. Getsy talk about the performance art including the person's personality and their artwork, it was interesting. It really definitely made me aware of how I make my art and how, let's say, my personality would be shown through another person's eyes.